So here we go with chapter 4. At the police station, I told the uniformed officer at reception that I was there to meet a client of mine for an interview with Detectives Cleary and Jenkins. He made a call, then told me my client wasn't there yet, but that I could wait in interview 3. As he was talking, a woman walked in who looked about 19 years old, with straight black hair cut above her shoulders, no makeup, very blue eyes, and a scattering of freckles. Under her peacoat, she wore blue jeans, black high-top Keds, and a red pocket T-shirt. A badge in a holder stuck out of one pocket, and a Glock 9mm sat on her hip. The gun looked big and heavy. I was a little worried it might pull her pants down, but not too worried. "Sally," the uniform called out, "can you take this guy up to I-3? "Sure." The gate buzzed, and I followed her up a flight of stairs. We passed frosted glass doors stenciled with squad names, and then the hallway opened out into a large room with 8 metal desks arranged in pairs. 3 of the desks were occupied. At one, an officer in plain clothes was speaking into the telephone, repeating, "uh-huh," at rhythmic intervals. At another, a detective typed with 2 fingers, filling in boxes on a pre-printed form, while an elderly woman wearing a pillbox hat sat in a wooden chair next to the desk and wept silently into an embroidered handkerchief. A third detective sat with his feet up on his desk, staring at the ceiling where a murder of pencils was stuck into the acoustic tiles. His eyes locked on mine and followed me across the room. "Here you go," Sally said. She opened a door, no frosted glass, stepped out of the way, and shut the door behind me. This was not a happy place. Disinfectant spray was fighting a losing battle against the smells of fear, cruelty, boredom, and cigarette smoke. There was no window. I looked at myself in a mirror set into one wall. The harsh light provided by the single fluorescent bulb overhead combined with the green institutional paint to give me a death cast. Lovely, I thought. The only furniture was a gray metal industrial table with a rubber top and 5 padded metal chairs scattered around it. The metal sliders on the chair legs had left many telltale dents and scrapes in the cracked linoleum, and no amount of scrubbing would ever remove the twilight of black scuff marks left by the crepe soles of comfortable cop shoes. I put my bag on the table and sat facing the door. I could hear the occasional passing of feet outside it, the continued pecking at the keyboard, ringing phones. I waited. After 15 minutes, when I thought I had been forgotten, the hot tomboy cop, Sally, poked her head in. "Detective Jenkins called in to say he was running a few minutes late. You want some coffee?" "Sure. Black, please. 1 sugar." She looked at me for a long moment without a trace of amusement. "Follow me," she said, leaving. By the time I was out of the room, she was halfway down the hall. I trotted to catch up, and she led me into a room similar in feel to the other, but with no odor, no door, a smaller table with 4 chairs, a selection of outdated magazines, a stained, pilled orange couch covered in cigarette burns, and a coffee station in the corner. Here, the smell of burnt coffee did what the disinfectant spray couldn't. Sally poured herself a cup, grabbed a donut from a box next to the coffee maker, and gestured for me to help myself. Then she sat on the sofa, put her feet up on the coffee table, and watched intently as I poured. "I know you," she said as I stirred in 1 teaspoon of sugar. "You do?" "Yeah, I think we went to school together." I laughed. "I don't think so." "What's so funny?" "Well, it's just, I think I'm quite a bit older than you." "Yeah, so do most of the skells I bust. You went to Fordham, right? Lincoln Center?" "Yes, I went to law school there." "Yeah, I know." She reached down to scratch her foot, and the cuff of her jeans rode up, revealing an ankle holster and another gun. This one was more her size. "You don't remember me, do you?" She definitely hadn't gone to law school with me. She was too young. No, sorry, I can't place you. I was one of the jurors in your fake trial. They pulled us from John Jay. One evening, 8 years ago? You've got quite a memory. Yeah, it comes in handy on the street, I'll tell you. You were good. I voted to convict your guy anyway. You were the one. Yep, I was the one. Her smile made her look 15 instead of 19. So what are you doing here? A friend's roommate killed himself last night. They want to ask her some questions. You here for moral support? Yes. This the guy they found hanging? Yes. She stood. Well, I got some reports to file, she said, adjusting the Glock on her hip. But you can wait in here instead of I3. It's a little more pleasant. Tell your friend not to worry. Jenkins and Cleary are good. They'll get to the bottom of it. Wait a minute, I said as she started to leave. Get to the bottom of what? When they get here, I'll tell them where you are, she said, and walked away. From the doorway, I watched her sit at one of the 8 desks, insert a form into a typewriter, and start filling it in. What was there to get to the bottom of? I thought today was routine. I only came because Jenkins had pissed me off, and I could be a white knight for a hot girl. The cop under the pencils was giving me the eye again, so I retreated to the couch. I tried reading a copy of U.S. News and World Report, but it was even more boring than it must have been 2 years ago. I closed my eyes and massaged the back of my neck to work away the tension before my monster headache returned. Late night, counselor? I started. I must have drifted off. Jenkins was standing in the doorway, Cynthia behind him. Good morning, detective. I stood. Before we start, I'd like to have a few minutes alone with my client in I3. I'll come get you when we're ready. I squeezed by him without waiting for his permission, took Cynthia by the elbow and led her to the interview room. She dropped her bag on the table and went over to the mirror to examine herself, as I had. I look awful, she said. I disagreed, but I kept my mouth shut. Her face was drawn, her eyes a paler shade of green than the night before, but she was still a sight to see. She leaned in closer to the mirror, as if she was looking for something. When I woke up, it took me a moment to figure out where I was, to remember what happened last night. It's like things are short-circuiting, colliding inside me, and I can't identify any of them. I keep wondering what it is I'm supposed to feel. There'd be something wrong with you if you knew what to feel right now. I suppose. As she continued to look at the mirror, I wondered if Jenkins and Cleary were watching from the other side, listening to us. It hasn't sunk in at all. It doesn't make sense to me. I don't think it makes sense to the police either. What do you mean? I get the feeling from the way they were treating the crime scene and from their attitude that there's some things that don't add up. Don't add up? About Alex killing himself? How would they know? They didn't know him. They didn't live with him, for Christ's sake. I'm the one who should have seen it coming. I'm the one who should have... She stopped and her eyes fluttered around the room like a frightened bird with nowhere to land. Should have what? I asked. I should have seen it coming. Maybe there was nothing to see. What do you mean? I mean, you can't start taking responsibility for this. You have no idea what happened, why he did it, what he was keeping from you. I wanted to say something that would help her, but I had the feeling whatever we were about to learn from the police wasn't going to make things any easier on her. I pulled out the chair at the end of the table closest to the door. Sit here, I told her. She sat, and I took the chair next to her. Did Jenkins or Cleary speak to you before they brought you to me? No. I bumped into them in the lobby downstairs. They said good morning and all, but nothing about last night. All right. When they come in, they're going to start asking a lot of hard questions. If it gets rough or you start getting upset, let me know, and I'll get us out of here. She nodded. Are you ready for them? Yes. When I opened the door, Jenkins was standing at the desk of the pencil cop speaking to Cleary. Cleary saw me and interrupted Jenkins. Jenkins looked my way and then said something to Pencil, who laughed. Then Jenkins headed in with his partner, and I shut the door behind them. Cleary sat on the far side of the table facing us. and Jenkins leaned against the wall behind him as Cleary placed a manila folder on the table and cleared his throat. "Thank you for coming down to speak with us, Miss Hull. We know that last night was difficult for you." Jenkins snorted and scowled. Cleary paused, took a deep breath, and continued. "There are a few questions that we have about—" I interrupted him. "I'm sorry, Detective, but before we go any further with this, I want something clear. I'm here as Miss Hull's attorney. I have instructed her not to say anything and not to answer any questions you might have. I have so advised her in light of your partner's assertion last night that she is a suspect in this matter. Perhaps we got off on the wrong foot and she is not a suspect. If that's the case, I would be happy to revise my instructions, and I'm sure she would be happy to cooperate with your investigation in any way that you might require. Counselor, I'm sure you can understand. It was late, we were tired, coming off a long shift, and a questionable crime scene always makes us a little tense. What I'm looking for, Detective, is an apology and a determination from you as to whether my client is the focus of any investigation. Look, Mr. Brandis, I'm sorry if it seems that— Detective, I don't have a problem with you, but your partner is a rude son of a bitch." Jenkins came off the wall and took 2 steps towards me, but Cleary held up a hand to stop him. I continued. "He clearly stated that my client is a suspect. Until that assessment is revised, we have nothing to say. We're leaving unless she is arrested and charged." Cleary stared at me, his hand still raised. Jenkins next to him, clenching and unclenching his fists. I was relaxed, my legs crossed, one hand resting on the table. Cynthia played it like a trooper and met Cleary's steely stare with a level gaze. Finally, Cleary smiled and laughed. "You're right. He is a rude son of a bitch. But he's also a good cop and the best partner I've ever had, so I let it go most of the time." Jenkins pulled the corners of his mouth back in what might have been a smile and resumed his stance against the wall. "My client is not a suspect." Cleary nodded at Cynthia. "As a matter of fact, it doesn't even look like a homicide has been committed, and that's all we really care about." "Then what is it we can help you with?" "It's just paperwork now. It wasn't a murder, so we just have a few questions to help us decide whether to classify this as an accidental death or a suicide." Had Alex been— Cynthia interrupted him. "Alex wouldn't have killed himself." "No?" Cleary asked. Cynthia looked down at her hands clasped on the table in front of her. "No. He'd been through so much." "Uh-huh. Maybe he'd been through enough." "No, don't you see? He'd been through it." She looked at me. "I mean, sure, things had been going badly for him, but he always used to joke about it. He'd say, 'I've been down so long, it looks like up to me.'" "Cynthia," I said, "you were telling me only last night how depressed he'd been lately." She looked back at her hands. "He just wouldn't have done it." I looked at Cleary and shrugged. We both knew that suicide is not easy for survivors to accept. "How long had you known him?" Cleary asked. "About 6 years." "Why don't you tell us about him?" Cleary suggested. Cynthia looked at me, her eyebrows raised. I nodded, and she filled them in with what she had told me the night before. As she spoke, I could hear in her voice, in the little details she recounted of their life together, the obvious affection she had for this man. Adding up all the factors, the suicide of his fiancée, separation from his family, lack of career, loss of job, Alex's suicide was not an unlikely result. When she was done, Cleary nodded and opened the thin folder in front of him. "You say he had just lost his job?" "Yes." "Where was he working?" "He was bartending at 2 places, Tempo and Hentai." The 2 cops exchanged a look. "Hentai," Cleary said. "And what happened?" "He was fired." "From both? Why?" "They have the same owners, and they accused him of abusing his buybacks." "What does that mean?" "You know, someone's at the bar buying a lot of drinks. Every house has a policy. If the customer seems to be a big spender, or if he's a regular, after so many rounds, the bartender can buy one. It varies. Some places the bartender has a lot of discretions. Anyway, sometimes a bartender abuses the system. How exactly? Well, unless the manager is keeping a really close eye on the bar, there's no way to keep track of who the bartender is giving the buybacks to. You're supposed to enter them into the system, but the manager only sees the totals at the end of the night. The bartender can cheat by giving the free drinks to friends instead of to the good customers like he's supposed to. And that's what Alex was doing? No, that's just an excuse they gave for firing him. How do you know? Because Alex hated that place. Which place? Hentai or Tempo? Both. They're not the crowd he ran with at all. Alex didn't want his friends coming in anyway. It was strictly a money gig for him. The money was good. It was really good. Alex only worked 3 nights a week to make what he needed. Of course, he didn't need all that much. Was he upset about being fired? Enough to kill himself? Cynthia's voice ratcheted up a notch. No, he wasn't upset enough over losing a fucking bartending job to kill himself. Why are you asking all these stupid... I put my hand on her arm. Sin, relax. They didn't know him. They're just following threads, trying to get a picture. Just answer their questions. This could go on for a while. She looked down, and after a few moments, her hands released their grip on the arms of the chair. Yes, he was upset. He liked only having to work a few shifts a week, and good bartending jobs are hard to come by. Also, since he was fired and not laid off, he had some trouble with his unemployment claim. He had a big fight with one of the managers over it. She looked up at Cleary. But he still wasn't upset enough to kill himself. Cleary looked over at Jenkins, who shrugged. Cleary looked at the open folder in front of him and scanned a couple of pages. Let's move on, he said. Did Alex have any unusual sexual proclivities? Cynthia was taken aback. What? What are you talking about? Well, there's no easy way to say this. There's some details, some irregularities that make it look as if this wasn't necessarily a suicide. Like what? I asked. You think he might have been murdered? No, it doesn't really look like that either. Then what? It seems to me that it has to be one or the other. Cleary looked uncomfortable. He cleared his throat again. It might have been an accident. Cynthia jumped in. What do you mean it might have been an accident? You think he was, what, rehearsing a stunt for a play or something? That's ridiculous. No, not rehearsing. It's just, well, there was no note, and Jenkins piped up. We think he might have been a choker. There was a moan of silence. I was stunned. Cynthia was clueless. A choker? We said in unison. Why the hell would you think that? I asked. Wait a minute. Cynthia was looking at all three of us, trying to catch up. What do you mean? What's a choker? Jenkins leaned against the wall and shook his head. Cleary continued to look uncomfortable. They left it to me to break it to her. Cowards. I turned to Cynthia, took both of her hands in mine. What they're trying to say is this. They think Alex might have died an accidental death due to autoerotic asphyxiation. I'm going to sign off in a few minutes, but be sure to subscribe to this channel and go to MatthewArkin.com to sign up for my newsletter.